In 1665, the streets of London were filthy and the city was overcrowded. Shanty towns surrounded the city, housing hundreds of thousands of laborers and craftspeople. With conditions just right, bubonic plague began to spread, and before long, thousands were falling ill in what would become known as the Great Plague of London. Lord Mayor Sir John Lawrence, realizing the disease might be spread by animals and that the streets were filled with stray dogs and cats, ordered a massive cull of the strays. These were the same stray animals that, unbeknownst to the authorities, hunted the rats carrying the fleas that spread the plague. So the irony was that in taking action he hoped would help control the plague, the Lord Mayor more than likely helped it to explode. How should we judge someone like Sir John Lawrence? Is it fair to ridicule him for his poorly informed decision, or to accuse him of ordering the call because he hated cats and dogs? Should we remember him for all the additional deaths caused by his call, or as someone who made an unfortunate choice given limited information in a grave situation? There's not much choice except to feel sorry for him. He obviously wasn't negligent. He was making decisions, not sitting at home pretending there was no crisis at hand. And he wasn't malicious either. Nobody at the time knew that rats carried the fleas that harbored the plague-causing bacteria. Plus, the idea that strays were spreading the plague wasn't too off the wall. So there's only one reasonable judgment. His decision wasn't criminal. It's hard to even say he was at fault at all. The Lord Mayor made the decision because he cared about the residents of London, and that remains true regardless of the consequences of his decision. Exploring the Analects, Episode 23, Passages 4.3 and 4.4, Love and Hate. Hey folks, this is Elliot Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for Episode 23 of Exploring the Analects. In this episode, we'll be covering passages 4.3 and 4.4 of the Analects focused on human-heartedness, judgment, and hatred. We'll be looking at situations not too different from the ones Sir John Lawrence found himself in to understand the Confucian view on when condemnation is appropriate and what people can do to free themselves from bad intentions. As always, I'll read the passages in Chinese and English, explain the ideas behind them and provide some historical context, then analyze the language found in the passages as a way to learn new words and phrases in classical Chinese and modern Mandarin. If this is your first time listening, be sure to subscribe and drop me a hello in the comments. One quick note before we kick things off. I've made a ton of updates to Analects.net over the past few weeks, including contextual definitions for every single character in the book, improved accuracy of pinyin for special pronunciations, clickable links on English translations that highlight the associated Chinese characters, and 2 new reader modes that let you experience the Analects in classical, vertical, right-to-left reader styles. Plus, I'm about to push an update releasing tools that help you practice understanding those pesky grammatical particles. I'm also excited to announce that within the next couple of weeks, you'll be able to download iOS and Android apps with everything on Analects.net, plus 2 museum-quality historical manuscripts and 1 woodblock print of the Analects to read anywhere, online or offline, with all the tools you need to learn and understand. As soon as those are available, I'll update the website with the links, Alright, let's get started. Here are the passages in a modern Mandarin pronunciation, followed by my translations into English. 4.3 子曰唯仁者能好人能恶人 The master said, only the human-hearted are capable of loving people and capable of hating people. 4.4 子曰苟志于仁矣无恶也 The master said, if you just set your will on human-heartedness, you will have no bad intentions. Let's start off with a quick explanation of these passages according to the most common interpretation. Both of these passages are focused on the cardinal Confucian virtue of ren, human-heartedness. We'll review exactly what ren is a little later in this episode, but for the time being, just keep in mind that both of these passages center on this virtue, with the first focused on those who possess it, and the second focus on those who aspire to it. In the case of those who possess human-heartedness, passage 4.3, we read that only these people are capable of loving and capable of hating others. It's important to understand the function of capable here because it's doing a lot of work. It's not that people lacking human-heartedness can't love and hate others. You'll absolutely find them doing so. But when it comes to loving and hating others in the appropriate fashion, and for the appropriate reasons, this is a capability you'll find only among the human-hearted. This is a kind of justice is blind argument. The idea is that those who don't possess sufficient human-heartedness find themselves loving some and hating others for personal or selfish reasons. Maybe someone is the nicest guy in the world, but he just happens to look like the bully who beat you up in middle school. Or maybe you're allergic to dogs, and your neighbor has a dog. Now these aren't great reasons to dislike someone. It's the same reason jury selection in the US judicial system is such a rigorous process. Harboring prejudice means individuals on trial risk being judged on factors that are irrelevant to their cases. For those who aspire to human-heartedness, which is the topic of passage 4.4, we read that when your will is set on human-heartedness, your heart will be free of bad intentions. Now, bad intentions may sound a bit vague, but I found something wrong with every other option. Evil is just a bit strong, and it's a pretty loaded term. I wouldn't want you thinking we're talking about the devil incarnate here. And spite only covers one aspect of bad intentions, and the same with other words like cruelty, pettiness, and so forth. So I'm sticking with bad intentions, but I want you to know that this could be any sort of pettiness, jealousy, malice, cruelty, or other ways of being mean-spirited that you can imagine. According to 4.4, you don't even need to truly possess human-heartedness to avoid having bad intentions. All you need to do is aspire to human-heartedness, and you won't have any bad intentions toward others. This is the reason most people would find it difficult to judge Sir John Lawrence harshly for ordering the cull of strays. Given everything we know, that understanding of the spread of disease was only in its very nascence in the 1600s, that he realized animals in squalor might be contributing to the spread, and so forth, we can only assume that his intentions were good, irrespective of the results. Now that you've got the basic idea behind these passages, let's do a bit of a deep dive into the meaning of ren, or human-heartedness. Even if you've heard this before, you might want to listen to this refresher, especially since it's been quite a few episodes since we encountered a passage focused on it. Ren is the primary virtue of the Analects, and that's no small thing, since this book is just jam-packed with other virtues like xiao, respect for parents, li, ritually appropriate behavior, zhong, wholehearted devotion, and xin, trustworthiness. As the primary virtue of the Analects, it's not uncommon that you'll see Ren translated simply as virtue or benevolence. And I really wouldn't fault a translator for that, except to say that being virtuous means something just a little bit different to everyone, so it's usually the right move to try to get just a bit more specific. Scholars of Chinese philosophy, along with most translators, agree that Ren usually doesn't refer to just any old type of virtue. It's always associated with relationships between people. In Analects 1.2, Confucius's disciple Youzi famously explains that Ren can grow out of our earliest and closest relationships, those with our parents and siblings. From these familial relationships comes our ability to connect with and have empathy towards others. So relationships with parents can act as a model for relationships with teachers at school, bosses at work, and leaders in your community. And relationships with siblings help us learn to build relationships with friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Ren is understanding deep in your heart and mind the position of others, and how their circumstances affect their own hearts and minds, then using that understanding to treat them with dignity, care, and respect. With that context, I hope it makes sense that I tend to choose human-heartedness as my translation of Ren. So keep in mind that image of someone who has learned to prioritize human relationships and whose heart is filled with compassion for others, and the interpretations of passages 4.3 and 4.4 should make a lot more sense to you. Human-heartedness is about understanding others and about putting humaneness and humanity at the center of your values. If you possess human-heartedness, according to 4.3, you're supposed to have that objectivity and clarity of judgment that others lack. You won't be swayed when strangers try to flatter you. You won't be jealous when a coworker gets that promotion you've been hoping for. You'll be able to put aside selfish desires and understand when it's actually appropriate for you to want or possess something. The point is, those without human-heartedness will have trouble avoiding many such pitfalls. And in failing to avoid them, they'll lose the capability to judge or to properly love and properly hate other people. And in terms of 4.4, if you aspire to human-heartedness, you won't have bad intentions when interacting with others. It might help to read this as a sort of challenge by Confucius to his students. I imagine they'd come to him frequently claiming to understand or possess Ren, or just wanting to know if they're making progress toward it. Well, what better way would there have been than to show them how far along they were by asking them to consider if they've recently acted jealous or malicious, or to point out cases where he'd observed them acting in those ways. It's a lot like passage 13.27, the one we covered in episode 8, where Confucius said, "If one is resolute in making decisions, and has the grit to follow through, if they choose simplicity in both appearance and words, then they may approach having human-heartedness." If you can recognize qualities like grit and simplicity in your behavior, then you're approaching human-heartedness. If you find your own behaviors to be petty and jealous, then you're probably not approaching it. Now that we've covered Ren, I'm going to wade into murkier territory. I can already hear some of you saying, "That's good enough for me. Please stop right now and don't confuse me with alternative interpretations and translation issues." But I guess you're just gonna have to bear with me, because of course it couldn't possibly be as simple as a single interpretation. These are 2,500-year-old words after all, and that's more than enough time to come up with a few different ways to read them. The most controversial character in these two passages is or wu. That's one character read with two different pronunciations. According to the translation above, it's wu in passage 4.3, and it's in passage 4.4. In 4.3, we've translated the character as hating, and in 4.4, we've translated it as bad intentions. But again, it's one character, and it appears in two passages right next to one another, so why should we translate them in different ways? Isn't it just as likely, if not more likely, that it means the same thing between the two? Well, here's what happens if we do that. 4.3 becomes, only the human-hearted are capable of loving people and capable of hating people. And 4.4 becomes, if you just set your will on human-heartedness, you will have no hate. You see the problem, right? If we translate it as wu to hate, and we use hate in both passages, they seem to flat out contradict one another. So if you decide they must mean the same thing, or be two forms of the same word, you might wonder, what's exactly going on with this book? Is there some kind of a translation issue? Is there some difference between striving for human-heartedness and truly possessing it that makes a certain kind of hatred possible? Well, here's the simplest explanation. This one comes from Robert Eno's commentary in The Analects of Confucius, a teaching translation, which, by the way, is available for free for download through the Indiana University website. He writes, "These two passages seem contradictory, suggesting the Analects' complex editorial process. And that's honestly no worse of an explanation than any of the others I've read. The Analects was written and compiled by many individuals over the course of several centuries. The text itself makes it clear that the disciples had different interpretation of Confucius's philosophies, even when he was alive. After his death, a number of disciples went on to found their own schools, some very influential. So maybe one disciple felt that the human-hearted could love and could hate, but another felt hatred was never appropriate. Or it could have been that some Confucians were taking this license to love and hate as a pretext to selfishly gain advantage over others, so the latter passage was included as a way to temper the first." We could speculate all you want about these two seemingly contradictory passages and how they ended up next to one another. The point here is that it wasn't just the ideas of Confucius that made it into the Analects. It was also the ideas of his major disciples like Youzi, who we heard from before, and Zhengshen, as well as many never-to-be-known compilers who collected, arranged, and edited what would become a relatively stable and coherent text only several centuries after Confucius's death. Though it's worth noting, these two sayings side by side are in Book 4, which many scholars consider the oldest and most carefully composed part of the text. So whoever placed them next to each other probably wasn't embarrassed or confused by the pair. If you reject the notion that the book might contradict itself, and insist that these passages must make sense together somehow, that's when you'll want to start reading the traditional commentaries. There are two schools here. The first I'll call the hating bad intentions camp. They take this character and wu to have two distinct pronunciations and two distinct meanings, hate in 4.3 and bad intentions in 4.4. The second I'll call the pure hatred camp. They take everything to be just woo or hate. Let's start with the hating bad intentions camp. Among Confucian scholars, Han Dynasty scholar Kong An Guo had settled on this interpretation in the 2nd century BCE, and it was later cemented as canon by the great synthesizer Zhu Xi in the 12th century. These folks argue for a sort of ladder of attaining human-heartedness. On that ladder, 4.4's no bad intentions is several rungs lower than 4.3's ability to love and hate. It's like you're stepping onto the ladder when you set your will on human-heartedness. And just by stepping onto it, you'll avoid having bad intentions. But it's only when you've climbed quite a bit higher that you'll gain the ability to properly love and properly hate others. As it happens, the oldest surviving use of 4.4, from centuries before either camp existed, already reads it as the hating bad intention camp does. It appears in the春秋繁露, the luxuriant dew of the spring and autumn annals. This is a Han Dynasty work traditionally attributed to the jurist Dong Zhongshu. The luxuriant dew mines the Chunqiu, the spring and autumn annals, a historical chronicle that was traditionally credited to Confucius himself, for hidden moral judgments. This analytical technique is called Weiyan Dayi, small words with big meaning. It treats the annals' word choices as verdicts. For example, when the annals describes a killing as shi rather than sha, this brands it as a regicide, not just a mere killing. An attack labeled fa is a declared legitimate campaign, while qin marks an unauthorized incursion. And what the annals doesn't say can be a verdict too, as you're about to see. Here's a story from the luxuriant dew. In the state of Song, Duke Xuan had a son named Yu Yi and a brother named Mu. On his deathbed, instead of doing what was expected and naming his son's successor, Duke Xuan chose his brother. Years later, on his own deathbed, Mu repaid the kindness. He returned the throne to Yu Yi and exiled his own son to the neighboring state of Zheng to prevent any type of competition or animosity. It didn't work. Song and Zheng fought war after war, and eventually a powerful Song minister murdered Yu Yi and brought Mu's son home to take the throne. So, how should Duke Xuan and his brother be judged? Imagine the Attorney General of the afterlife weighing charges. There are two on the table, the lesser charge of violating the order of succession, and the graver one, that the two of them colluded to shut Yu Yi out of succession. It's kind of like the difference between manslaughter and murder. The result is the same, but the intent is the key. If the brothers had harbored ill will towards Yu Yi, the graver charge fits. But the evidence points the other way. Mu gave the throne back at the cost of exiling his own son. And that's not the behavior of a co-conspirator. The Han legal tradition had a slogan for exactly this type of reasoning. 论心定罪, assessing the heart to determine the crime. So the luxuriant dew's verdict was, the Duke and his brother made principled but problematic decisions that were well-intentioned, but contrary to the rules, and ultimately disastrous. Their aspiration to human-heartedness shields them from the charge of harboring bad intentions, but their rule-breaking bars them from praise. Since the Annals itself was unable to condemn or endorse, it says nothing about them at all. The Fan Lu reads this silence through the small word's big meaning lens and sees that as the verdict. The Fan Lu wrapped up this story by rendering judgment in the words we know as passage 4.4. 苟志於仁不惡. They aspired to human-heartedness, so no bad intent could be pinned on them. Let's move on to the pure hatred camp, the one that reads both 4.3 and 4.4 with wu, or hate. This interpretation only surfaced much later, starting in the 11th century with Su Zhe, brother of the famous poet Su Dongpo, and no small-timer himself, since he was a vice grand counselor. The evidence this camp offers for its interpretation is relatively thin. The commentaries I reviewed didn't quote any known works to justify the opinion, so it seems like they just expected the Analects to speak for itself. And that does make some sense. If you tally up the occurrences of this word in the Analects, it means hate about twice as often as it means anything else. So it usually means hate, and if it obviously means hate in nearby passages like 4.3 and 4.6, then why shouldn't it also have the same meaning in 4.4? Well, I tend to be a fan of letting the text stand as evidence for itself, so based on the statistics alone, I'd support this argument. But then I think back to the Eno quote about remembering what happens when we read 4.3 and 4.4 like this. They immediately seem to contradict one another. So the pure hatred camp has some real work to do finding a way to extract itself from that contradiction. The guy who made the best case for how to do that was Wang Kaiyun, a late 19th century and early 20th century scholar who worked with some of the most consequential statesmen in late imperial and early republican Chinese history, like Zhong Guofan and Yuan Shikai. He made the argument that these passages described a kind of tough love. Here's what he wrote. The human-hearted love people, even those they reject, discard, banish, or exile. They wish to see reform themselves, and they take measures for their safety. It is not only the fully human-hearted who are free of hatred. Anyone who merely sets his heart on human-heartedness has nothing he personally hates. In other words, those with any degree of human-heartedness love people, so even when they must reject others, this is done out of concern, and never with animus. But remember, 4.3 does in fact say that the human-hearted are capable of hating people, so it sounds like we need to take a closer look at what kind of hatred the human-hearted might have. For this, we can turn to passage 17.24, possibly the most in-depth discussion of hatred in the Analects. Here, Confucius's businessman disciple, Tze Gong, asks if the exemplary person also feels hate. What follows is a list of things that Confucius says the exemplary person can hate. It includes those who proclaim the faults of others, those who, occupying an inferior position, slander their superiors, those who act courageously but lack propriety, and those who are resolute and daring but overly stubborn. Tze Gong goes on to list what he hates, including those who parrot others' ideas and mistake this for wisdom, those who mistake insubordination for courage, and those who mistake the malicious exposing of others' private affairs for uprightness. Well, just in case you started thinking about something else while I was reading, it's worth noting what is and what isn't in that list. It is a list of ways people act, along with the judgment that these ways of acting are worth hating. It is not a list of types of people. It's not the rich or the poor, farmers or soldiers, or any particular type of identity or status. So again, the reading supported by Wang and the pure hatred camp is that the human-hearted can love people and can hate people, but this hatred is actually a moral objection to behaviors as well as a care for their rectification. And unlike those without human-heartedness, whose hatred is often selfish and biased, the human-hearted never detest an entire class of people. Wrapping up the overview of the pure hatred camp, I want to clarify the fact that none of this, the tough love reading, the behavior not people distinction, etc., actually comes from Wang himself. He makes the assertion, but he doesn't argue for it. The case only holds up because we went looking for it. Passage 17.24 is sitting there right in the Analects, possibly something he had in mind. But we'll never know, because he never bothers to cite it. Alright, that just about does it for the varying interpretations of these passages. So let's move on to learn a bit of Chinese from the characters, starting with 4.3. 为仁者能好人能恶人. At a very basic one-to-one translation of each character, we get only human-hearted ones can love people, can hate people. 为 here means only, and is the same character you'll find in the modern Mandarin, 唯一, the only or sole thing, often in a group. For example, I could say, 我是班里唯一的男生. I'm the only male student in the class, which is true since I've been doing a lot of Pilates recently. One interesting side note is that this character is substituted for 心字旁为 in some editions. All commentators say that these two characters have exactly the same meaning. 仁者 is the human-hearted, where 者 is a nominalizer found in both modern and classical Chinese. You can also translate this as people who possess human-heartedness. At least, you can do that until dogs or aliens with human-heartedness show up. Neng appears twice in 能好人 and 能恶人. In both cases, it indicates not just possibility, but capacity or capability, again, just like it does in modern Mandarin. And finally, 好人 and 恶人. Of course, you'll already be aware that 好 doesn't mean good, and it's not an adjective. It means to approve, appreciate, or love, as it usually does throughout the Analects. Don't forget it's that fourth tone. And wu, as its opposite, means to hate. It's very much up for grabs how to translate these two given their proximity to one another, so depending on how charged or directed a given translation is, you might find pairs like affection and hostility, like and dislike, or love and loathe. Finally, we have to string these three clauses together, so only human-hearted ones can love people and can hate people is filled out in whatever way makes it clear that the referent of the latter two clauses is the human-hearted. I brilliantly strung them together with the fancy words are and. On to 4.4, 苟志于仁矣无恶也. Again, starting with one-to-one translation, just set the will on human-heartedness. It is lacking badness. Go is a soft conditional, meaning it probably needs an if, but as long as you can indicate a potential future state that won't be too difficult to achieve, you're probably doing it right. So you might use go in the sentence, would you just give it a chance? It's not asking for much. Zhi is the same character you might know from the modern Mandarin zhi yuan zhe, a volunteer, and tong zhi, a comrade, or literally, one with whom you share aspirations. You know, this is workers of the world unite stuff. The idea here is that you're wholeheartedly invested in an idea or a goal, not being coerced and not being cajoled in any way. Yu is a classical Chinese grammatical particle meaning to, on, or with. It's always good to stay flexible with this one, and in this case, the target of yu is ren. Yi is another classical Chinese grammatical particle with a number of meanings, but in this case, it indicates completion of a change. The change in this case is becoming willing, so the will is now set. Wu, everyone should know, modern Mandarin or classical Chinese, this is one of the most common ways to say without or to lack. And we've already discussed ad nauseum, and if you don't remember it could mean hate or badness, you might want to restart this episode. You might be wondering where the intent crept into my translation. Well, I partially blame the Slingerland translation for that, but the reason it works is because of zhi and ren. You could think of it like having your will set on human-heartedness, and that has pushed out any other type of intent, including the bad ones. And to round this off, we've got ye. This is the classical Chinese grammatical marker for a statement, so it often doesn't get rendered into any actual words, but if we go back to that one-to-one translation above, it's the copula, it is. Again, needing to string together the clauses since the word-for-word translation just set the will on human-heartedness, it is lacking badness, is a little bit too raw and doesn't make the subject or relationships clear. I personally amplified the conditionality of go and directed the passage at the reader by writing if you, just, and then added yi and zhi to write set your will, after which you had to be rendered as on. So up to this point we're at if you just set your will on. Then in the second clause we continued with you as the subject, and the conditionality requires will as a potential future. Wu, being a lack of possession, means we can say have no, since lacking sounds a little bit too negative for something you don't want to begin with. And finally, has to reflect badness, but is supplemented with intent since we're discussing the will, so we end up with bad intent. So the second part of this phrase becomes, you will have no bad intent. Alright, folks, thanks for sticking with me. This might just be the longest episode by word count yet. Next time, we'll read passage 7.10. You're definitely going to want to tune in if you've ever thought to yourself, was Confucius the original emo kid? Quite the question to be pondering. See you there.